This is Dr. Ziziamianis, your rumpled professor. I'm doing a quick review of the week 9 readings around disgust and contempt. And I've added arrogance, but Ekman's book is disgust and contempt. And also, I'm doing a review of the academic literature on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and self-determination theory. So again, that's what we're headed. We'll get right to it. I don't want to waste your time. I've been a little long-winded at points. This one, I've only used about 20 pages, and I'm making a few comments on each page. So I'm hoping it doesn't take that long. Again, I would encourage you to use this this review to find spots of interest for you. And if you are, feeling unmotivated to get to the readings, a lot of times I bring you right to some of the main points. You can drill down into it nicely. So let's get started. Chapter 8 is on disgust and contempt. Really, again, he describes this as writing 30 years ago. That's Ekman. It's a feeling of aversion, a taste of something you want to spit out, and so on. Again, the key word here is aversion. And I would even put the keyword separation, something you want to get out. Your aversion to, you want to get away from you. Keywords like repulsive, right? Signals something like physical disgust. Again, that sense of, ugh, get it away from me. There's also social and aesthetic disgust, when people are disgusted by some of the things other people do. Or again, the sight of blood or witnessing a surgery or something like that. It's more of an idea, the image. So, it's a little bit obvious, but some of these sources of disgust are universal. He tries to drill down, Ekman tries to drill down on those things. His mentor, Rosen, found that the most potent universal triggers are bodily products like feces, vomit, urine, mucus, and blood. But the interesting thing about him was this. He had you do a thought experiment, and you might want to actually try this, okay? It says, think first of swallowing the saliva in your mouth. I'm told, most people do. It says, then imagine expectorating it into a glass and then drinking it. What he found is that most people found it okay when they just swallowed it inside themselves, but they expectorated it out and then drank it back in. That was somehow disgusting. What I find interesting about this is that when one has a feeling of intimacy and inside, it's not disgusting. But when one brings it outside and then back in, there's a separation cost, okay, and then brings it back in, all of a sudden there's a disgust. So there's something about disgust that has to do with something leaving you and then coming back, and it's kind of changed its identity, even though it hasn't really changed his physical makeup. Frankly, I'm not that worried about it. If I spit into a glass and do it, my son does it all the time. Molecularly, it's the same. I understand this emotional sentiment, but I'm not too bothered by that personally. So I'm not a great study on that one. This Rosen person lists 4 groups of learned interpersonal triggers around disgust: the strange, the diseased, the misfortunate, and the morally tainted. What's interesting about this is that those things that are physically disgusting and stuff don't hold a candle to moral disgust. The most frequently mentioned trigger for extreme disgust, and this was in college students, was 62% had to do with immorally objectionable behavior, such as Nazi concentration camps, pedophilia, and so forth. That's a really interesting note, because it seems to me that especially in advanced modern societies, the things we traditionally discuss us go by the wayside, but social and moral disgust is very much at the forefront. Again, here's this notion of something going on the outside. Miller's quite extraordinary insight suggests a social function of disgust not otherwise apparent. The suspension of disgust establishes intimacy. Now they're talking about when people start swapping spit and exchanging bodily fluids as they get sexual, or even when you're cleaning up vomit for your child. When there's a love relationship or intimate relationship, emotional relationship in there, all of a sudden that seems to transform the notion of disgust. Someone's bodily fluids, whether it's vomit or something else, ends up becoming not so disgusting. In fact, in some sense, it can become even attractive. I think the interesting thing to note here, and this is on page 178, by the way, is that it's not so much about the substance itself or even the act itself, it's the context around it as intimate or feeling inside or close to you or connected to you or feeling away or outside. This is something we've discussed already in the first two videos, but it comes up again in this reading. Okay, let's keep going. All right. And again, this notion of disgust when someone is objectified, the self or another. Again, when someone's objectified, they're being degraded or dehumanized and placed outside the norms of respect. So there's again this notion of distancing. Okay. Contempt. We run into contempt now. Here was an interesting point. Again, this is on page 181, that contempt doesn't always have to go from top to bottom. There can be contempt from bottom to top, oftentimes in response. Servants for masters, women for men, teenagers for adults, and particularly teenagers who think they know it all. So it's like, oh, you don't know, you're not cool, you don't know these sorts of things. Again, when you get into a situation of contempt, where one's trying to put themselves over the other one tries to recover that by saying, no, there's some ways I'm over you. So again, we get into a battle, an escalating battle of who's better than whom. There is another interesting thing down here about what the effects of contempt are, the studied effects. When husbands show contempt to their wives in Gottman, and Gottman is one of the leading researchers on marriage. He has some of the most successful and well-run research on marriage and claims to be able to predict divorce with a 90+% rate of accuracy because he's able to look at what happens in the interaction between men and women emotionally. And here's what he found, that when husbands showed contempt to the wives felt flooded, believed that their problems could not be worked out, believed their marital problems were severe, and became ill often over the following 4 years. So emotions have real effects, not only the emotions of a partner, but also in terms of their own physical being. Contempt is not simply just an option if you're looking to create a healthy situation between you and another person. So that's page 181. I don't want to go too much into that. You can read the entire chapter. It has more to do with things like how to detect disgust or contempt in another person. For me, I think it's pretty obvious. Sometimes people can be pretty contemptuous without letting it show on their faces, and that's one of the main things that even Ekman admits, that people will oftentimes hide their emotion. But you can feel the energy of it, and you can certainly see it in the outcome of their behavior and how they're treating you in subtle ways and in direct ways. So I'm more interested in that, how treatment and how subtle signs and energy that a person sends broadcasts how they're feeling, and less so facial expressions. If you're interested, though, please do read on in that. Chapter 5, the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, gets at least a nominal Dr. Seuss seal of approval. It's fairly clear, does a pretty good explanation, has some good charts in it. So mark that one up for possible citation for your final project. Again, this is the Reeve paper, Reeve paper, chapter 5, under Understanding Motivation and Emotion, 5th edition. And this is chapter 5. So let's jump right on into it. Again, the main things here have to do with intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. They do a great job of explaining the distinction, and they do it in a few pages. The article or chapter is much longer, but I'm going to really just concentrate on that distinction. So here we go. Intrinsic motivation is the inherent propensity to engage one's interests and to exercise one's capacities, and in doing so to seek out and master optimal challenges. It emerges spontaneously from psychological needs and innate strivings for growth. Key word here is growth. Again, rather than threat, we're looking to open ourselves and grow. So again, there's some requirements. There are some different requirements for intrinsic motivation and some different effects. People who experience intrinsic motivation because they have psychological needs within themselves. Uh, this guy says they arise spontaneously to give an experience of a psychological need and satisfaction. I'm not sure if I agree with that altogether. Okay, and we'll go on to explain that. Here's the one that I outlined and put in your assignment. Something about the activity allows a person to feel free, which means autonomy, effective, in other words, competent, and emotionally close, that is, having to do with relatedness. When feeling this way, people express their intrinsic motivation by saying, that's interesting, that's fun, or I enjoy doing that. For instance, interest in feeling free can spark the desire to read a book, and enjoyment in feeling competent can involve a person in a challenging crossword puzzle for hours. What I like is this chart here of showing what the kind of contributors to intrinsic motivation are and how they're reinforced. We talked about autonomy from the environment and relationships, competence support, and relatedness support. Again, the key word here is support. You don't have an environment that supports these kinds of things. It is hard to develop intrinsic motivation when everyone's going against you or just simply ignoring you altogether. That's what's important about communities. It's important about families. It's important about education systems. If those environments aren't there to create autonomy, which is freedom, competence, right, which has to do with interest in the development of ability and growth, and relatedness, which has to do with intimate and warm and supportive relationships, it becomes much more difficult for someone to learn and to be passionate and intrinsically motivated to learn. Now, here's where I had a little disagreement with the reading. It says intrinsic motivation, and what page is this? Let's see here. It's page 112. Okay, intrinsic motivation is a natural motivation that emerges spontaneously out of a person's psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I would question this a little bit. In other words, from my work in education, I know that it is natural, that is, it has to do with our natural talents, affinities, and so forth, but it could be learned and supported. In other words, and people can learn interests that they had that they didn't know about. That's the whole point of liberal arts education, expose you to things that you didn't even know you had interest in. And again, that couldn't happen just accidentally or just sort of quote unquote naturally. You somewhat artificially are exposing yourself to things you wouldn't just run across. So it's natural, yes, in its makeup, but there are things that can be learned and supported in terms of exposing you to things that you might be intrinsically motivated to engage that you just simply weren't aware about. Again, this is the job of a community education system and a broad education. And the notion that intrinsic motivation is spontaneous, yes, I get that. In other words, it's not directly towards something else. It's not heavily mediated, and it's certainly not controlled. That's extrinsic. But it can be planned for. Intrinsic motivation, when you begin to understand, for instance, in education, a person's learning style and some of the things they're interested in, okay, you put those things around them and then the spontaneity comes from. It doesn't just come, just because someone just randomly hits something. So I'm agreeing with them, but I'm also saying you need to extend that a little bit. Some of the real great benefits of intrinsic motivation, people who are intrinsically motivated have greater persistence, greater creativity. Again, one of the worst things for creativity is to have someone over you, controlling you. And don't paint that tree purple, it's green, something like that. Again, you can imagine, I'm sure a lot of you have run into this as kids and probably can be accused of it as parents, because it's not always, you're not always able to accommodate maybe perhaps creativity. Control is sometimes called for. So people will be most creative when they feel motivated primarily by the interest, enjoyment, satisfaction, and challenge of the work itself, rather than by external pressures. That's key. Okay, and again, when it comes to high quality learning with intrinsic motivation, the learning is of a very different sort. Conceptual understanding, this broader picture, reflective understanding, rather than rote. Okay, when someone is controlled, they start to diminish. When they feel threat, their learning and their learning centers start to shut down, and then they just focus on a narrow task. But that narrow task is alienated. It doesn't involve their passions, so then they become demotivated even to do that. So again, you have that sort of spiral downward. When if you want to create a spiral upward when it comes to learning and growth, you begin to engage a person in the things that they're interested in, passionate, challenge them to contribute, to question themselves, to think about things in an anti-intuitive way, as well as an intuitive way. So rather than the functional just do it, you're beginning to see things more in terms of a complex, conceptual, bigger picture way. So it says optimal functioning and well-being. Intrinsic goals lead to better functioning and higher psychological well-being, financial success, social recognition, and physical image, which is then does pursuing extrinsic goals. If you do it for reasons of how it makes you look, rather than how it makes you feel on the inside, how it makes you look on the outside, you don't do as well. Greater intrinsic creates greater self-actualization, greater subjective vitality, less anxiety and depression, greater self-esteem, less use of drugs and alcohol, and the list goes on. Again, notice this notion of being attached and one, okay? Connected rather than separated. And when you become separated and you start doing things for instrumental or extrinsic reasons, all of a sudden you become alienated from your deeper spirit, your deeper internal gifts and desires and passions. And it's no surprise that you begin to lose interest, lose passion, and feel like life has left you. Because you've kind of left life. Okay, so extrinsic motivation arises from an environmental incentives and consequences such as food, money, praise, attention, etc., etc. Now, the one I didn't agree with was scholarships. I said, I got a scholarship, and what it did was it bought me the time to concentrate on intrinsic things. But I get what he's saying. Extrinsic has to do with the absorbing, taking, consuming, out there, out there, out there. And intrinsic has more to do with producing, creating, and engaging, okay? In here, in here, in here, okay? Right? Extrinsic is separate and apart, okay? It has to do with a consequence, right? It has to do with you trying to get a need met through a proxy, right? Through a method, through following a rule, right? To avoid consequences out there. And attract good consequences here. But look what that says to you when you're motivated by that. You're saying, I'm not good enough here. I need to get this thing out here to make me complete. So it's not a surprise that extrinsic motivation actually erodes your motivation over time, your performance over time. Because you're not building up in here. You're not gaining momentum and energizing from here. You're always having to go from the outside. And if you look at it, the addictive energy of trying to take something from the outside to get a thrill or for meaning, as with drugs, you notice you have to take more and more of it in order to get the same effect. With the internal, it actually operates the opposite. The more and more you build up this insight and build these warm and intimate connections with others, the less and less effort you have to put into it in order to get more and more out of it. It's a generative process, right? Or a regenerative process, whereas extrinsic tends to be a degenerative process where you have to get more and more and you get less and less effect. Whereas with intrinsic, it's the opposite. You have to provide less and less in order to get more and more as you begin to develop this growth and these connections with others. So let's continue. Extrinsic motivation arises from do this and you will get that, a behavioral contact. And in order to motivation. Again, you're treating yourself as an instrument, as an object in order to get something that you hope will come back to you and make you happy or something like that. And it's also selfish. What's in it for me? It's not service oriented. It's not geared toward connection or service toward another. So again, we're already seeing some of the reasons why the research shows that extrinsic motivation doesn't actually work very well. And I put a little star here. The essential difference between the two types of motivation lies in the source that energizes and directs the behavior. Energizes is an important word here. With intrinsically motivated behavior, the motivation emanates from spontaneous psychological need satisfaction the activity itself provides. With extrinsically motivated behavior, the motivation emanates from incentives and consequences made contingent on enacting a particular behavior. So again, I don't think we have to beat a dead horse on that. I think you're getting the sense of intrinsic versus extrinsic. And I just skipped over a bunch of pages. That was that last page there was 114. This page is 137. It's one of the last ones. Building interest. I thought this was helpful, okay, because it shows you there are external aspects of interest, objects and activity that are novel, surprising, need satisfying, and internal aspects of interest, right? An enduring disposition to prefer certain kinds of activity. And this also goes with learning style. There's Howard Gardner's different kinds of learners, ones that are social, ones that are intrapersonal, ones that are kinesthetic, or they learn best by moving. So that would be an example of that as well. And so this creates an actual experience or interest, and this creates a whole bunch of qualities that are very helpful for learning, like attention, knowledge, achievement, and so forth. Here's the next one. This is the Richard Ryan, Oxford Handbook of Human Motivation. It's the chapter 6 in that, Deci and Ryan. Actually, I used Deci and Ryan in my own research on self-esteem. Low, not quite 2 decades ago, about 18 years ago. So they've been in the game for a while. I'm mainly emphasizing the abstract here. Self-determination theory maintains and has provided empirical support, that means actually researched concrete support, for the proposition that all human beings have fundamental psychological needs to be competent, autonomous, and related to others. Satisfaction of these basic needs facilitates people's autonomous motivation, acting with a sense of full endorsement and choice, volition meaning choice, whereas thwarting the needs promotes controlled motivation. Again, these keywords, thwart and controlled motivation. Feeling pressured to behave in particular ways, or being amotivated, that is lacking any motivation at all. Again, I have found in my work with so-called learning disabled kids who turned out not to be learning disabled, they were differently able, and we were able to do really well. Many of them had problems with motivation because their learning style wasn't being engaged. So they become broken, because they didn't do the rote way, and so they give up. So a lot of times motivation has to do with a lack of connection with intrinsic motivation of a child or of a learner or of a client if you happen to be in a counseling service. So if it's a couple's, one just doesn't have interest in the other or doesn't understand them, and so the other one doesn't feel heard or felt, then loses motivation to continue to put energy into the relationship because it's just not working. So so this has a lot of implications, right? Adaptive and generative, like I said. There's a difference. I put this a difference between millennial generation and the baby boomers, their parents. Baby boomers usually been taught within their upbringing to look at the American dream in terms of the extrinsic, in terms of the goods that could be generated, the jobs that could be gotten. The millennial generation tends to look at it in a more intrinsic way. Job satisfaction, experience, travel, and so forth. And from what I can see, at least with the people I know, these two, millennials and baby boomers, are beginning to exchange a little bit. Certainly the parents are providing some of the material support that they've stockpiled. But I think millennials too are beginning to develop some kind of leadership to show their own parents how the intrinsic aspects of life can be in some sense more rewarding, which is important when we have a limited planet and we can't just simply exploit resources. So I put this just as a kind of joke. I'm not lazy, I'm intrinsically motivated. I just enjoy this stuff here. I don't feel the need to prove myself and achieve in that kind of way. So that's funny. Anyway, we go on here. In healthy individual development, people move in the direction of greater autonomy. We talked about that, integrating external regulations over behavior and maintaining intrinsic motivation. So it's not just internal. A healthy person that does successfully enjoy intrinsic motivation also has an ability to work with society, to follow rules, okay? But it's not the center of what they do. It's just something that helps. Okay, disposed of the dog there. The barking dog in the background. Okay, I put a little bit of a star next to here. This is a pretty good a summary at the very end of this particular article, page 103. It says people's autonomous and controlled motivations, as well as their intrinsic and extrinsic life goals, are influenced to a significant degree in both the immediate situation and developmentally over time by the degree to which their social contexts support versus thwart their basic psychological needs. Again, we talked about individual emotional health and how much it is tied into healthy, supportive community and society. Very hard to do this without some kind of support. If someone's ignoring you or even going against you, very hard to maintain that by yourself. Community does matter. We already talked about the American dream and extrinsic versus intrinsic understandings of that. And it becomes important from a political and cultural level too, because as wealth gets concentrated, as Deci and Ryan have put here, as wealth becomes concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, controlling more and more people, it becomes harder to create the environment for people to make their own choices, that is, have autonomy, and begin to explore and exchange those. So these things are linked. It's not just an individual thing, it's also very much a social thing, providing people with opportunities and support and resources to develop their intrinsic motivation. This is the last paper, comes from Theories of Social Psychology, Volume 1, edited by Lange, Krolansky, and Higgins. The particular chapter here is Deci and Ryan again, self-determination theory. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, so we'll just do a few minutes here. Many social psychological theories have tended either implicitly or explicitly to view learning, that is, acquiring the attitudes, values, motivations, and behaviors primarily in terms of social environments, teaching individuals what to think, value, need, and do. This view has been called the standard social science model. That's the standard science, model. Notice it's exterior extrinsic, right? It's most clearly conveyed in social learning theory, where modeling and reinforcements are the principal mechanisms of learning and growth. Again, this control outside, top down for the most part. Now, the social determination, self-determination theory is very much more bottom up, more intrinsic, more controlled by the person. It's more inherently active, intrinsically motivated, and oriented toward developing naturally through integrative processes. Okay? Human beings need particular nutrients. I like this analogy. Pro-social emotions are kind of like psychological nutrients. They're kind of the vitamin A, B, and C of you. When you have empathy, when you have appreciation, these are the kinds of nutrients, psychological nutrients, that will enhance intrinsic motivation and emotional well-being. So I think that's a nice metaphor to think about this. It's a very useful one. Okay. And finally, this is the last page here. So what did I put up here? Important, not peripheral. Okay. I just put this. I said, notice how we tend to value in our education system math and science, which tends to be more competitive, more quantitative, more money-oriented, more extrinsic. And the arts and music, well, those are the things that schools are most likely to get rid of first. They're seen as luxuries. And yet they have to do with more of the intrinsic motivation, the creative drive, and so forth. Self-determination theory, if anything, if self-determination theory were to set up a school, it would probably put art and music at the center, because it would be shown that those are more intrinsically motivating for most people. And these other things around it. And actually it turns out that Mozart actually can help you do math and other things better. So, again, it says rewards do not always motivate subsequent persistence. It turns out, again, we've already said this, that extrinsic rewards and extrinsic consequences actually end up being a poor motivator long term, because they tend to objectify the person versus recognizing the growth and interest and having that momentum. So that pretty much concludes the reading. We will just leave it there. Again, it's not necessarily if you to actually to see me do the video here, but at least you understand the mindset. You get a little bit of craft understanding about how to look quickly at a research article and begin to bring out the important research points. I'm trying to teach you a craft about how to see these things. Also, If you happen to be more of an auditory or visual learner, seeing me in video will help you process the material better as I'm sort of leading it through. Again, most of this is from my background in teaching and learning. Psychology of learning really has shown me that engaging you in a personal way with your own life stories, applying it to things that matter to you, is a very motivating activity. It's intrinsically motivating because you think, if I actually look and get into Zeus's assignments and try these thought experiments, it's going to help me succeed. It's going to help me save time. It's going to help me develop a better relationship with my family or my partner. And that's the whole point here. Research is good insofar as it can help you do these things. This class is successful insofar as it can help you do these things. Again, I give really thanks to you reciprocating and getting me more intrinsically motivated, because your work and your quality has been consistently very high. So again, I just wanted to offer my support and congratulations for doing that. Let's continue to make this a great and rich and growing experience for all of us. Until next time, this concludes week 9's material. We'll talk again. Again, the work here is not due until the beginning of next week, but if you want to get an early start on it, please be my guest. Until then, we'll see you. Bye.